In April of 1975, with the fall of Saigon looming, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese were displaced. The mothers of children born to American GIs were particularly concerned about the fate of their biracial children at the hands of the North Vietnamese army. The American response to this issue, Operation Babylift, changed the lives of thousands of families. It is history that deserves to be remembered. American forces had withdrawn from Vietnam, and the fate of the children of the conflict looked bleak. United States forces officially withdrew from Vietnam in 1973 after the Paris Peace Accord, but in 1975, as Communist North Vietnam began overtaking the South Vietnamese ambassador to the United Nations asked for aid in relocating refugees, particularly orphans, in Saigon. Food supplies were short, and many humanitarian organizations felt obliged to help. On April 3rd, in response to the pleas of the vulnerable ones left behind in the withdrawal, President Ford announced 2,000 orphans from South Vietnam would be evacuating to the United States within 36 to 48 hours. It was a monumental task to put together the diplomacy and logistics in such a tight time frame, but Ford saw it as an obligation. In his conclusion, he said, "This is the least that we can do." President Ford's response led to the creation of Operation Babylift. The command of such a swift operation involving babies and small children was fraught with difficulties. The organization in charge of this swift and careful operation was the Military Airlift Command, or MAC. The MAC was well versed in non-combatant evacuation operations and used their own aircraft or contracted the use of commercial airlines to move civilians out of dangerous and hostile environments. However, the chain of command for these operations was quite long, as the State Department handled the overarching international affairs. Next in the chain of command is the Department of Defense, then the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then, at the time of Operation Babylift, MAC, and finally the individual commanders in charge of the actual evacuations. To illustrate this long and unwieldy chain of command, on April 3rd, 1975, after the President's announcement, and yet without a written command, the Joint Chiefs of Staff notified the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Command and the Air Force Chief of Staff that they had authorization to begin the mission. Then the logistics director of the organization of the Joint Chiefs of Staff authorized the first 2 MAC flights, although he clarified further flight authorizations would have to come from the State Department and Pacific Command. Another difficulty the rescuers and evacuees faced was the sheer number of seats necessary for evacuating the children and their in-flight caretakers. C-5s and C-141s were being used for cargo missions, not transporting troops, so seats had to be brought in from all over the country, from as far away as Dover, Delaware. Adding to the cumbersome details were the civilian nonprofit organizations and relief agencies that were using the same airfield for chartered and sometimes unauthorized flights. On April 2nd, an unauthorized commercial flight through World Airlines had already brought 54 children out of Saigon. World Airlines President Ed Daly did not have U.S. Embassy or Vietnamese authorization to extract the children. Yet he flew to Yokota Air Base in Japan, where he was again not authorized, but was allowed to land simply because there was no other landing field within a reasonable distance. Counting on public opinion of the humanitarian mission to keep him out of trouble, Daly brought the children to the U.S., where the embassy then had to figure out the legal status of the orphans. This led to immigration services granting them each a 90-day visa to have time to sort the details out, and shortly thereafter a blanket approval was granted for 2,000 Vietnamese orphans to enter the United States. Operation Babylift captured the hearts of many, as babies and children often do. Quick decisions were made upon hearing the children from a war-torn nation needed loving homes, as made apparent by the large number of families who quickly signed up for adoptions. Part of the appeal of rescuing the orphans was a sense of proactive optimism as a response to a war that was so divisive. But at the same time, there was skepticism. Were these children really being rescued? Were they really even orphans, or were they being taken away from their biological families and brought unnecessarily into a completely different culture? With war refugees fleeing further south and American aid dwindling, food supplies were scarce. Orphanages began taking on children whose families simply couldn't feed them, but perhaps intended to reclaim them when they were able. Those in charge of the orphanages wanted to protect these children and so were eager to relocate them and quickly accepted the offer of placement in countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and France. In the shuffle of war, paperwork was bare bones or lacking completely. Some parents handed over their children, simply hoping for a better life for them than that in their war-torn nation. Although official documentation had yet to be lined up, after President Ford's announcement on April 3rd, and in cooperation with multiple adoption agencies such as Catholic Relief Services, Friends for All Children, Migration and Refugee Services, and more, General Paul Colton authorized the use of a giant C-5A that was scheduled to drop off a load of howitzers. With its 73-seat upper troop deck and floor loading in the massive cargo space, its orders were to move the children out of Vietnam, effective immediately. But the C-5A Galaxy had known safety issues at the time. It tended to crack along the wings. General Carleton decided after this first flight the operation would switch to the C-141s. However, the first official Operation Babylift flight, using a C-5A, left Vietnam at 4:03 in the afternoon on April 24th, with 228 orphans and 86 crew, caretakers, and a handful of other evacuees intended for Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The plane was piloted by Captain Dennis Bud Traynor and co-pilot Captain Tilford Harp. They were to meet medical personnel at Clark for evaluation and then would fly on to San Diego, where President Ford was waiting to meet them. The youngest babies and children were handed into the plane via human chain and loaded in the troop area, 2 to a seat. The rest were sitting on blankets in the cargo area, held in place with tie-down straps. Their medical records were stored towards the back of the airplane. 12 minutes after takeoff, all over the South China Sea, the rear bay door exploded open, depressurizing the cargo area and shooting debris among those seated there. The door hit cables to the hydraulic system and took out a part of the tail, causing the pilots to lose control of the plane. They also lost the use of the elevators, pitch trim, and all but one aileron. Luckily, the elevators had been set for 260 knots before the hydraulics were lost, so as long as the plane maintained that speed, it could still fly. In the few minutes after the decompression, the pilots discovered when they banked and decreased power, the plane went into a dive. But if they banked and increased power, the nose would come up. By changing the roll and the power, they were able to bring the plane safely back towards the runway, but after hitting 4,000 feet and coming up on their final approach, the plane began a quick descent of 4,000 feet per minute. The landing gear had added drag, reducing their speed and causing the plane to drop. Knowing they wouldn't make the runway, Captain Traynor had his co-pilot bring the wings level, as he applied full throttle to bring the nose up, and at 50 feet, they idled and touched down in a rice paddy. The plane skidded for 1,000 feet, became airborne for another half mile, and finally hit a dike and broke apart. The cargo compartment took the brunt of the force from skidding and crashing and basically disintegrated. Immediately following the crash, the surviving crew members began removing children from the wreckage, despite their own injuries. The loadmaster, Senior Master Sergeant Howard Perkins, had broken his leg. He used a crutch and an airplane seat belt to splint it so he could help the orphans. 2 of the flight nurses, one with a broken leg, one with a broken collarbone, also relayed children to the rescue helicopters who were on scene within 5 minutes of the crash. Out of the 314 people aboard, 176 survived. The losses included 78 orphans, 35 of the 36 DAO members aboard, 11 Air Force personnel, and 3 civilian family members. Only 8 people survived from the cargo compartment. All the paperwork for the orphans was also lost in the crash. The survivors lost any information about their birth dates and biological families, and some of the deceased were unknown. It was one of the most deadly accidents in military aircraft history. Lee Ann Thiemann, who assisted on another one of the flights, who ended up adopting one of the children from Operation Babylift, said of the crash, "In a country seemingly fated for tragedy, even that basic humanitarian mission had ended in doom." Before the accident could be fully investigated, the wreck was scavenged for parts by Vietnamese nationals, especially the communications and avionics equipment. One investigator commented that when they arrived, 400 to 500 people were at the site, stripping the plane and walking off with the parts. The United States government paid a bounty to recover what they could from the locals. Thankfully, out at sea, the Navy had been able to locate the in-flight recorder along with the ramp and bay door. They determined the locking mechanisms had been replaced sometime before this flight and subsequently failed, leading to the explosive depressurization. The C-5A crash resulted in multiple lawsuits against Lockheed Aircraft Corporation. In 1982, Lockheed settled $13.5 million for the 45 injured orphans adopted into the U.S. In 1984, $19.7 million was awarded to injured orphans from the crash living outside the U.S., and in 1986, $10 million was awarded to the representatives of 76 orphans who were killed in the crash. For their actions in landing the plane, Captains Traynor and Harp were both awarded the Air Force Cross. Author Andrea Warren noted in her 2008 book, Escape from Saigon, that the crash focused the world's attention on the plight of the orphaned children of South Vietnam. Adoption agencies were overrun with people volunteering to adopt the children. She noted a toll-free number was set up in Washington, D.C. to handle the inquiries. At times, more than 1,000 calls a minute were turned away by busy signals. Operation Babylift continued, eventually airlifting approximately 3,000 children out of Vietnam. Nurse Joyce Harrington recalled a flight on a 747. The final count was 409 orphans, 300 of which were under a year and a half old. They were in bassinets, in seats, under seats, and in the aisles. When I would start to nod off while feeding a baby, someone else would kindly remind me that there were many more that still needed attention. Some of the older children were afraid of using the enclosed toilets, or afraid of the dark, so extra latrines and lights were brought in. Leanne Thiemann talked about her flight. She said that in all the commotion of loading and transporting babies, there hadn't been able to feed them all. Now suddenly all 90 were awake and crying simultaneously. After dealing with many children with air sickness, the caregivers realized that they had been giving meat to children accustomed to rice. New supplies were brought in at each stop, including different brands of formula, causing many of the children to develop diarrhea. The children were flown from Saigon to Clark Air Base in the Philippines and then on to Hawaii, and after a stop in Hawaii, they were then brought to California. At each stop, they needed care, and so volunteers turned out by the hundreds from the Red Cross, Family Services, and even off-duty personnel and their dependents would lend a hand, passing out juice and cookies or comforting babies. While they were greeted by smiling volunteers and willing medical aid, the often malnourished and sickly children sometimes spoke of living family members. This led to a class action lawsuit filed in mid-May against the United States and the adoption agencies. It alleged that some of the children weren't orphans and had been illegally taken from their homeland, and that the defendants had an obligation to return them to their biological parents. Although the class action suit was denied as the judge felt that each child needed a separate case, many individual cases did end up being filed. Vietnamese parents thought that they were handing their children over for temporary care during wartime. They then came to the U.S. hoping to locate and reclaim their children. While some of the adoptive parents were understandingly and willingly returned them, others felt it was inappropriate to abandon these children in a manner that Americans thought of as permanent, only to return for them later. Some of the children from Operation Babylift, and now middle-aged adults, began to wonder about their biological families, and because of modern DNA testing and social media, many of them have been able to locate their parents. By any standard, Operation Babylift was an impressive logistical accomplishment and was done by people who were truly well-meaning. It changed many lives and undoubtedly saved many lives, but it also received quite a lot of criticism, from inadequate selection procedures to using overcrowded and unsafe aircraft. Some people even wrote the entire project off as nothing but a cynical political ploy. See, history's like that sometimes. Sometimes it's messy. It's hard to tell the heroes from the villains. In this case, the facts on the ground, that there were children who needed help, took people on both sides of the political spectrum regarding the Vietnam War, and it left them wondering what to do. Leanne Thiemann remembered a discussion on her flight. She asked what these children might be thinking, and one of the other volunteers said, most of them have been taught to fear these large military planes, and now they've been placed on one to be taken away from everything they have ever known and loved. But she responded, but what were the choices? Imagine what life would have been like if they'd stayed in Vietnam. You see, we get to scrutinize these events as history. That's our luxury. But they had to deal with them at the time as best they could. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.